I'm Peter Suskind, director of the U.S.-Russia-China Trialogue Project at the Stimson Center. Since the middle of the 20th century, relations among the United States, Russia, and China have had an enormous impact on each country separately and on the world as a whole. The purpose of the Trialogue is to better understand this extraordinarily complex and consequential relationship by directly engaging with experts from all three countries. In this show, guests from across the political spectrum and from every corner of the globe share their views in their own voice. While the Stimson Center seeks to provide access to a wide variety of perspectives, it does not endorse any particular position. We leave it to the listeners to judge the validity and value of the views expressed by the guests. I hope you enjoy the podcast. My guest today is Zhao Long, Deputy Director of the Institute for International Strategic and Security Studies in Shanghai. Long is one of China's top experts on Russia, BRICS, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This is Long's second time on the podcast. Long, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me back.
So we'll cover the massive military parade and the big SCO summit in a moment, but let's start by discussing a different summit. What did Beijing make of the Trump-Putin meeting in Anchorage?
So I think everybody knows that was a game of signaling. Both sides walked away with very different interpretation of wins. On Trump's side, he acted mostly with instinct and transactional logic, which he wanted to show that the U.S. still can reassert influence over Russia, but without looking like he was giving Moscow a free pass. Putin, meanwhile, I think got exactly what he wanted. This is a very significant diplomatic achievement. That was his first visit over a decade to United States, and also the first time he stepped foot in NATO countries since the war outbreak. So I think this is, of course, a huge PR win back in Moscow. On the other hand, I think it's also quite clear that there's no substantial agreement on how we can resolve the Ukraine crisis. But the basic consensus is there. So Ukraine might have to make up some tough concessions, compromise on the territories, on the pause of NATO membership, maybe some kind of also security guarantee in return. And also, I think why I believe this summit should be regarded as a Putin's win, because Trump agreed that we shouldn't put the ceasefire on the first place, and everybody should be engaged in comprehensive negotiations on the peace deal, which exactly what Moscow wants. But from Beijing's perspective, Beijing isn't exactly losing sleep over this summit, right? Because although there's a headlines scream that this kind of a detente or reset of U.S.-Russia relationship could somehow impact on China's partnership with Russia. But I think there's a still very significant structural limits for this kind of detente. Trump may want a warmer relationship with Moscow, but the politics at home are brutal, right? He will face the midterms. He will face the pressures from both parties on Russia's policy. So, and I think there's also very obvious deficit in mutual trust. Look at the Alexa itself. There was supposed to be one-on-one summit, right? But it's turned out that three-on-three. So with very short notice, so no joint statement, no binding agreement. So I think though all this evidence that there's still a long way to go for this kind of a real rapprochement between Moscow and Washington. And that's why.
So your takeaway is that Putin scored a big PR victory.
Yes.
And also got a significant concession from Trump, at least in principle, when Trump agreed with the Russian position that an immediate ceasefire is unconstructive and that a comprehensive peace must be the priority.
Yes, exactly.
And do you think that we're any closer to a settlement in Ukraine? Do you think that the two sides behind closed doors really did find significant areas of overlap, or was it mostly a show?
No, I think both sides have this kind of inspiration to achieve at least some substantial outcomes in terms of ceasefire or peace agreement. But unfortunately, it's not totally depend on Moscow or Washington's position, right? It really matters how the Europe thinks and how the Ukraine could compromise. But I think in the near term, nobody wants to be the target of Trump. Nobody wants to piss off him, right? Nobody wants to disappoint him. So I think both sides, including Russia and Ukraine, should show some goodwill in terms of negotiation. So that I think that's why Putin just proposed that he would invite actually Zelensky to go to Moscow for negotiation. But I think this is almost impossible. But again, I think both sides will figure out what kind of high-level meetings should be set up in the coming weeks that show this kind of a goodwill to Trump. But
But
substantially,
so do
I
you
don't.
still think that we're stuck in a performative cycle where everybody is seeking Trump's favor and attention? Or does Beijing believe that we may be entering the final stages of the war? Not an immediate conclusion, but that some process has begun, which will eventually bring about serious peace talks.
I think this is kind of both sides of the coin. On the one hand, of course, both sides are trying to, get attention of Trump. But on the other side, of course, there could be a regard as the very first step of the long process of negotiation. At least for now, both sides agreed that there should be a kind of a framework of peace negotiation rather than the ceasefire monitoring or other things. But I think it requires a very comprehensive package of negotiation, including the process of ceasefire, including the territory issues, including I think the most difficult part is security guarantee. What kind of a security guarantee would meet the expectations of Kiev? Meanwhile, not so proactive to Russia. So I think we could anticipate by the end of this year starting process of this peace negotiation. But I'm a bit pessimistic about reaching a substantive peace agreement in the coming months.
Would China consider playing a role in guaranteeing Ukrainian security or signing on to an eventual peace settlement? I know Putin mentioned China as a potential guarantor. I think China officially said that it might consider such a proposition. What is your take?
Well, my interpretation is, of course, Putin proposed that, and not once. I think previously I also mentioned that this kind of idea. But the problem here is Beijing has no history of acting as this kind of a security guarantor in Europe. So any willingness to step into that role would be highly conditional and carefully calculated. So I think at least Beijing will maintain so-called strategic neutrality, and they insist on staying above the fray that any role must reaffirm the commitment to diplomacy, dialogue, or respect for sovereignty. But meanwhile, will be extremely cautious about reputational risk, which means it would not back guarantees that could backfire if the ceasefire collapses or endorse some territorial concessions that violate international norms. So I think China is willing to play, but only on the nonpartisan or risk-managed basis.
But so what would that look like? So almost assuredly no Chinese troops in Ukraine, or do you think that that might be a possibility?
No, I don't think there's a possibility that China will put our boots on the ground in Ukraine. The traditional peacekeeping model doesn't work here because thousands of kilometers of the contact lines requires the huge number of deployment. I don't think that could operate under the UN Security Council old model of peacekeeping. And I think China favors more indirect engagement, whether to use technological or observational tools, satellites, imagery, UAV surveillance, fixed monitoring posts, and etc. So I think this kind of a technical and diplomatic guarantor without putting boots on the front line would be something that China may consider. And of course, all those should be conducted on the transparent rules, defined boundaries, and mechanisms for intervention that both parties are agreed on. So I think the China's role will be very cautiously calculated, and I don't think the so-called the old model of peacekeeping worked here.
Are you and your colleagues and Chinese officials and perhaps their Russian counterparts having conversations now about what this might look like once peace is finally in the cards?
Yeah, internally, we very frequently have these kind of discussions, dialogues, even debate on whether China should step in or not. There's different scenarios and possible plans being discussed. And also, I think China cannot automatically resolve this kind of a trust deficit between Kiev and Moscow. So nobody could be the real guarantor for the possible restart of the war, right? So that's why China believes that it's not in Beijing's interest to play such role, which could force Beijing to be directly involved in the next possible war in Europe. So I think the majority of Chinese expert community believes that there certainly should be some kind of role for China, but it should not be equivalent to the role of US, Europe, or other direct involved parties.
Okay, so let's turn to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit that just took place in Tianjin. It was a big affair. Modi came in person. At what point did Beijing receive the message that Modi would participate?
Well, let's look at the ground picture here. The recent thaw in India-China relation isn't a sudden strategic shift or something, because we are seeing is carefully calibrated convergence of interests, right? First, I think both sides are facing the risk management fatigue, right? Years of borders, standoffs, patrol face-offs. I think both sides are really tired of this kind of high tensions in a border area. So that's why I think China wants to avoid a prolonged confrontation with our neighbor. And that's why I think Modi has the similar interest, that both sides' interests are converged on this point in Tianjin. And second, I think those are some, let's say, external factors played very significant role here, which of course Washington's position, Washington's approach towards to India. When Trump posed one of the highest level of tariffs on New Delhi, of course we could expect the shift of policy of India towards China, because China could be one of the leverage that Modi could use in this kind of a game, a great game with Trump. So there is a very clear strategic hedging and the balance of multiple relationships. And for Beijing, we can avoid the so-called two front of strategic squeeze, and also the China, India, Russia's gathering also increase the consensus or strategic understanding between three parties on the overall Eurasia continent's framework in the future. So this is, let's say, the invitation to Modi and his participation in the ICO summit in Tianjin is more tactical and focus on the risk reduction. But I don't think we can anticipate full alignment of India with China, because still there's some structural problems between two sides. I think that couldn't be resolved in the near term.
But so there has been a steady softening of tensions between India and China over perhaps the last year, maybe beginning with Xi and Modi's meeting at the BRICS summit in Russia. But Modi's appearance in China just now, you think is mostly, if not totally, a product of Trump's pressure on India, and that this is Modi showing Washington that he has other options. So does Beijing then regard this with a certain amount of distrust? Does China worry that it is being used as leverage in India American relations?
Well, partially, I think it is true that his visit to China could be regarded as a product of Trump's pressure, but I don't think Beijing is too much worried about it, because we always consider the grand picture of great power competitions and the interactions. So, from New Delhi's point of view, this is their nature to use the relationship with China as a leverage. And for Beijing, we could also use our relationship with India as a leverage too. So it's not necessary for us to hesitate to say that. But again, I think in terms of the comprehensive or substantial collaboration or the long-term perspective, I'm still quite thought about the consistency of Modi's approach towards China, because you've noticed that he didn't participate in September 3rd military parade. He just visited Tianjin and attended the SEAL summit and back home. So I think still we have to work on confidence building measures between two sides and continue to reduce those misperceptions, reduce the tensions on borders. Still, I think the Indo-Pacific strategy is there. Modi wouldn't just withdraw with that ground strategy, and still would continue to use that as a tool in these interactions with China. So Beijing would not be too naive to think that this is the turning point of India's policy towards China.
So the little hand-holding huddle between Xi, Putin, and Modi was the iconic image of the SCO summit, but you also had normal business proceedings of the organization. So tell us a little bit about those. What is the SCO? It's been around for quite a while now, but it has gotten much larger. So is there a grand Eurasian vision that this organization somehow represents? Or is it sort of a forum to discuss ad hoc issues and have meetings on the margins?
Oh, I think changing summit of SEO signals much more than ceremonial photos or just a gathering, because it marks a quite substantive evolution in how the SEO positions itself economically, institutionally, and strategically across Eurasia. Because first, the parties agreed to establish financial infrastructure. So almost 15 years ago, China proposed the idea of ICO development bank, then a more vision about institution building. And today, the party agreed that the connectivity projects, energy initiatives, and industrial park developments demands a long-term, low-cost, and reliable financing. So I think this is a big achievement at the Tianjin summit that the parties agreed on SCO Development Bank. I think this is similar to the new development bank of BRICS, and we could anticipate very positive interactions between this SCO New Development Bank and BRICS New Development Bank and AIIB. So I didn't think this is one
So
of
the
the
so China now, as an alternative to the Western financial institutions, has the Asian Infrastructure and Development Bank, this BRICS Development Bank, and now an SCO Development Bank. And there is overlapping membership in all three, but they each have slightly different rosters. Do they also have different sort of mechanisms and purposes, or is it mostly just that these banks cover somewhat different lists of countries?
Well, I think they are, of course, complementing to each other on those specific projects. But I don't think the parties are aiming for some alternatives of existing global or regional financial structure, because there's still many obstacles within those countries' financial systems. I think the main purpose of establishing those banks is trying to increase our resilience of our financial settlements and financial cooperation. and they increase the overall amount of local currency settlement. So I think all parties agreed that the US dollar dominated the global financial system are facing enormous challenges, in particular with those unilateral sanctions on different countries. So ICU members and other stakeholders are considering that there should be the plan B in those critical moments, that we could use it as the complementing platform to have this financial cooperation. So I think this bank is aiming for the long-term cooperation rather than just some response to the ad hoc issues.
When will the bank begin functioning?
It's not clear yet, but I think in the declaration, in the joint statement of SCO summit, all sides are agreed that they will speed up this process of establishing the bank. So I think given the past experiences, I think in the next 3 or 5 years, we could anticipate a new bank under the SCO framework.
I'd like to take a moment to highlight a new offering from the Stimson Center that should be of interest to fans of the Trialogue Podcast. My colleagues in the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program have a new limited-run podcast called The Strategy Sessions, featuring senior fellow Emma Ashford in conversation with a variety of foreign policy thinkers from across the political spectrum about the future of U.S. foreign policy. Enjoy this trailer for a preview of the new series.
The Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy program at the Stimson Center presents the Strategy Sessions podcast, a limited-run series that explores the diversity of opinions about the future direction of U.S. foreign policy. At a time when America's role in the world is contested and unclear, these conversations shed light on the exciting debates happening within the U.S. foreign policy community.
Absent the United States, the two directions that Europe can go is one, consolidation, and the other, disintegration. I tend to believe that it's going to be the latter one.
The defense industry is so far from a free market. It is a fantasy to pretend that these are truly private enterprises.
Which is this idea that in the absence of U.S. leadership or U.S. participation in a given problem, there will be instability, chaos, or just worse outcomes. This is, I guess, sometimes true, but it's not ipso facto true.
I'm Emma Ashford, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, and I'll be your host as we dig into the big questions surrounding the future of U.S. grand strategy, from progressivism to prioritization and techno-industrial strength to alliances. Find us beginning on September 15th wherever you get your podcasts, and make sure to subscribe now so you don't miss any episodes.
So another big piece of news that came out of the summit and Putin's visit to China was the announcement that a legally binding memorandum had been signed that the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline would be built. So gas that used to go from Russia to Europe would go through this pipeline to China. And this pipeline has been in the works for a while, but the two sides have not been able to agree to terms. Has that hurdle been cleared? Because it seems like this memorandum does not actually solve the price issue. Nobody's actually agreed to who pays for what and how much the gas is going to be sold for. So is this mostly just a signal to the West that Russia is going to continue to export energy to Asia? Or is this a substantial step toward the actual physical construction of this pipeline?
Well, I think you have rightly pointed out, although this is a significant step forward, that we have signed the memorandum, but still it remains as a memorandum. It's not final deal. So I think this project, Power of Siberia 2, has been discussed for years. Although Putin is really pushing this cooperation with China by his own meetings and the interactions with President Xi at the highest level. But I think a problem here is still at the technical level, still remain. But in general, I think this represents, you can call it a strategic pivot for Russia. to the East and to China on the energy sector. But also you can feel that it's part of a long-term strategy of energy security of China, of Beijing, because let's imagine if this project's being built up, there will be more than 50 billion cubic meters per year of Russian gas to China via Mongolia. So this is a substantial volume and enough to shape the regional and even the global energy geopolitics, right? But I think currently there's still some challenges and constraints. First, there's a risk, the transit risk through Mongolia, because I think the domestic politics are quite unpredictable in Mongolia, and the country is trying to balance not only between Russia and China, but also trying to involve some Western perspectives, right? I think this, of course, could be served as one of the uncertainties. And secondly, of course, it is related to pricing and cost sharing, right? The gas price, the delivery points, the transit fees remain unsolved. So I think Mongolia's limited fiscal capacity means that Russia and China will likely need to shoulder the financing responsibility, in particular China. But how we can deal with this gas price? Can we get some preference from Russia? And also
Well, Russia's been offering preferences for a while, and you say that this signals a pivot in strategy toward energy export to Asia. But as you also said, Putin has desired to make this pivot for years now, and even more so, obviously, since the start of the war in Ukraine and Europe's cutoff of Russian gas. So, what is stopping a deal from being made? Why is China playing hardball to such an extent in the negotiations? And has any progress really been made if the issue of price has not been resolved? Because that in any negotiation seems to be the paramount problem.
my reading here is currently the problem lays not on the strategical level, but also on the technical level. So, as I mentioned, the price is one thing. Another thing, of course, is the sanction. The sanctions on Russia may hinder the financing process and the access to the key technologies. As you know, those state-owned giants and companies are really cautious when it comes to the sanctions from Europe or US on Russia. So I think in short-term period of time, I think this is the biggest challenges for this negotiation. But I will be more optimistic about the future because let's say if we can anticipate even the temporary agreement on ceasefire or even on peace deal in Ukraine. So in that condition, I think China will be more proactive the negotiation on the pipelines. But currently, I think we are still stuck in those technical problems and negotiations with Russia.
Does China not worry that Russia's leverage would increase if the conflict in Ukraine is at least partially settled? Leverage, I mean, in negotiations over the pipeline and prices. Because right now, obviously, it's desperate to sell the energy that it can't export anywhere else. And obviously, this pipeline wouldn't be built and the gas wouldn't start flowing for years. But if a contract could be made now, Russia would probably give substantial preferences, as you put it, to China. But if in a few months relations with the US are normalized, Exxon is back in the Arctic, then perhaps Russia will have good reason to ask for a much higher price.
Well, to be honest, I'm not quite worried about that. The reason is quite simple. Let's just assume that there's some peace deal reached on Ukraine and some kind of a sanctions relief on Russia. But the key here is there's no equivalent alternative as China's market or China's demand to Russia's energy. So I don't think in the near or middle term that Russia and Europe could restore their energy like the times before the war. So without a European market, I don't think for Russia, for Moscow, they have other options to do rather than deepening their cooperation with China. So this is something that determined by those supply and demand side, not only by the sanctions or the geopolitical situation here.
So China knows that Russia has all this gas to sell and nobody to sell it to, and China is basically the only customer that provides the proper scale, so they're holding Russian feet to the fire and waiting for the best of terms and the safest of conditions. So at the SCO summit was followed by the 80th anniversary celebration of China's victory over Japan. And after seeing Putin, Xi, and Modi at the SCO summit, we saw Putin, Xi, and Kim at the Victory Day celebration. Was that the first time that they'd been together at all or in recent years?
I think it is the first time for them to be together in one same photo of three of them.
So what was the significance of that for China? How was that covered? Was it meant to be a big moment? How were these three leaders described and how was their relationship characterized?
They are the three people that Trump most wanted to meet, right? They're sitting together in Beijing, and it drives a lot of media attention. The immediate backdrop for this picture is Beijing wants the 80th anniversary of victory in the war to be remembered and to be promoted to the world media. The core theme was the historic memory, not bloc politics here. So I think China, Russia, and DPRK are all emphasize learning from the history. I do think we share the desire for regional peace and stability. So
No, so let's get back to history. You said that the core message was shared history and a particular memory of World War II. Trump wrote a post saying that the U.S. played a key or the crucial role in the defeat of Japan and should be remembered, but was being ignored. So is there a competition of historical narratives? In what way does China's narrative diverge from the United States? Do the North Korean, Russian, and Chinese narratives synchronize? So what is the historical representation of World War II that, or I guess it's not even World War II because from the Chinese perspective, it begins in the early 30s with the Japanese invasion. But so tell me the story that was represented a few days ago at the celebration.
Well, I think there is some kind of competition of narratives on the World War II, on what kind of a role that each country played in the victory against fascism. But that kind of a competition was not generated by China, because China felt that Beijing's role has been undermined of our victory against Japanese aggression, right? So the global narrative usually concentrated on the European side, the US, the Soviet Union, and other European countries. The so-called Eastern Front was somehow being ignored. So this is one reason why China, at this point, especially this year, are trying to emphasize and rebuild China's image as one of the key player or contributor to the peace and to the whole victory against fascism. Another one, of course, there's clear historical linkage between those three countries. Basically, they fight together in the same front against Japan, right? So at this current geopolitical situation, besides those realpolitik or the substantial interests on the ideological level, the historical linkage could be very useful tool for those three countries to reach some consensus on the regional frameworks or on how they envision the future international or global order. But I want to emphasize here is I don't think this kind of a gathering that's trying to signal that Beijing is willing to rebuild big triangle, right? The China, DPRK, Russia against the US, Japan, South Korea. No, not at all. Because we don't have the similar political realities in that region. And it's certainly not in the interest of China to be more engaged in confrontational structure with U.S. states in the Korean Peninsula. So I don't think this is something that China trying to send the signal to Washington.
Who's closer to Kim, Putin or Xi? Kim was just in Russia not too long ago. They signed a treaty. What that treaty actually binds each country to do is uncertain, but obviously North Korean troops were fighting in Kursk. Kim got into Putin's limo in Beijing. So is there any fear in China or anxiety about this triangle becoming a little bit lopsided?
Well, not too much, I would say, because this kind of relationship is not the one replace other by nature, right? DPRK needs both Russia and China, and in the various dimensions. Perhaps in the security or military cooperation dimension, the Moscow and Pyongyang getting more closer. There's no such room for China to do this kind of a policy maneuver, and China has no interest to be involved in war in Ukraine. But on the economic side, on the technological side, I think Beijing still enjoys a significant advantage in this cooperation with Pyongyang. So you've noticed that yesterday, President Xi hosted a meeting with Kim Jong-un, and they spent quite a long time, not only for the official meetings they had together, the coffee break and dinner. So I think that shows that Beijing is aiming for more stable and reliable relations with DPRK and trying to find a positive sentiment of the Russian DPRK's relations to contribute the regional stability rather to worry about Moscow and Pyongyang's collaboration in the military dimension.
So we've discussed three triangles: the US, Russia, China, India, Russia, China, and North Korea, Russia, China. I imagine the US, Russia, China triangle predominates, or the ones closer to home are acquiring greater importance.
To be honest, I'm not big fan of this, triangle. I'm more preferred the trilateral dialogues or interactions rather than so-called the concept of triangle, because the concept of triangle we inherited from the Cold War. So that's very easily to generate.
Actually, wait, just
people's-
to interrupt quickly, I don't think there's a concept of triangle in the US history of the Cold War. Is the actual
Oh, really?
term triangle used in China? I think it is, right?
Yes. The 大三角, we use the term of triangle very frequently, and
To refer
specifically
to
to refer to
which
the
three
Cold
parties?
War's relationship, USSR, China, and United States. So that's why I'm not quite big fan of this so-called triangle.
Because
But
it evokes memories of the Cold War, and China's
Yes.
position now is that the Cold War was not a wonderful state of affairs and should be avoided in any configuration in the future.
yeah, I think now the relationship becoming more complicated rather compared to the old times in Cold War. So that does not reflect the reality. And I think if we compare those three trilateral relations, let me put it in this way: the China-Russia DPRK relations is more stable because I think there's a more consistency in the policies and strategies, and there are more united vision about the regional stability and the regional structure. Of course, the U.S., Russia, China relationship has the more impact not only on the regional issues but on the global world order, and that will certainly determine the future trajectory of major power competition. And in the middle, the China, Russia, India relationship, I'm still quite skeptical about this composition of this framework because, as you know, we had such a mechanism of dialogue on the foreign ministers level, even on the head of states level between the three countries before the pandemic, right? And before the border disputes between China and India. But still, until now, this mechanism has not restored yet. So, although Modi was here in Tianjin, and it seems like the two leaders are trying to normalize our relationship, But at the middle level or on the ministerial level, I think there's still a standstill and a lot of obstacles that we should tackle in the future. So basically, this is my understanding in this kind of a comparison of three trilateral relations.
So the U.S. shouldn't worry too much about having lost India just yet.
Yes, I don't think you should worry that at all because, India always played like this, trying to navigate himself among the all major players and trying to build the image that India is the key part of this great power rivalry. But let's look at the reality. India seems like is welcome the U.S. strategy of containing China, Indo-Pacific strategy and others. On the other hand, it's trying to maintain their comprehensive partnership with Russia. Meanwhile, to reduce the risk and the tensions with China. So it's always trying to play a game among those major powers. I don't think the US has the capacity to have India on their side in the confrontation with China or Russia. But for China and Russia either. So we couldn't count on India's role in this ground competition. So I don't think US should be worried about that.
What was the coolest piece of technology or military item that you saw on display at the parade the other day? What were you most impressed by?
Well, technically speaking, I'm not the military guy, so I couldn't just name a few of them of the new weapons systems. So
Oh, but you can just go by category. Did you like big missiles,
no,
sleek
yeah.
submarines, or heavy artillery?
Well, in general, I think my understanding is the unmanned technologies, the UVs, the drones will determine the future war. So I'm more interested in that particular directions, that the advancement of China's technology of the big drones, the unmanned ships, even the helicopters, if you noticed. So I think in that particular sector, I think China is really advancing and enjoys significant advantage compared to other major powers.
It certainly seems to be true that drones are the future of warfare and that China produces the best drones at the moment. Although it is an irony that the country with the biggest army in the world is producing the most unmanned craft. But I suppose on that note, thank you very much for joining me once again on the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you again.
Thanks for listening to the Trialogue Podcast. Make sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss out on any episodes. The Trialogue Podcast is hosted by the Stimson Center and produced by University FM.